Episode 35. "And what do I need with a bit of old parchment?" said Harry.
"A bit of old parchment," said Fred,
closing his eyes with a grimace as though Harry had mortally offended him.
"Explain, George." "Well, when we were in our first year, Harry, young, carefree, and innocent,"
Harry snorted. He doubted whether Fred and George had ever been innocent.
"Well, more innocent than we are now. We got into a spot of bother with Filch. We let off a dung bomb in the corridor, and it upset him for some reason. So he hauled us off to his office and started threatening us with the usual detention, disembowelment, and we couldn't help noticing a drawer in one of his filing cabinets marked confiscated and highly dangerous."
"Don't tell me," said Harry, starting to grin.
"Well, what would you have done?" said Fred. "George caused a diversion by dropping another dung bomb. I whipped the drawer open and grabbed this." "It's not as bad as it sounds, you know," said George. "We don't reckon Filch ever found out how to work it. He probably suspected what it was, though, or he wouldn't have confiscated it."
"And how do you work it?"
"Oh, yes," said Fred, smirking. "This little beauty's taught us more than all the teachers in this school."
"You're winding me up," said Harry, looking at the ragged old bit of parchment.
"Oh, are we?" said George.
He took out his wand, touched the parchment lightly, and said,
"I solemnly swear that I am up to no good."
And at once thin ink lines began to spread like a spider's web from the point that George's wand had touched. They joined each other. They crisscrossed. They fanned into every corner of the parchment. Then words began to blossom across the top, great, curly, green words that proclaimed, "Messieurs Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, purveyors of aids to magical mischief makers, are proud to present the Marauder's map." It was a map showing every detail of the Hogwarts castle and grounds. But the truly remarkable thing were the tiny ink dots moving around it, each labeled with a name in minuscule writing. Astounded, Harry bent over it. A labeled dot in the top left corner showed that Professor Dumbledore was pacing in his study. The caretaker's cat, Mrs. Norris, was prowling the second floor, and Peeves the poltergeist was currently bouncing around the trophy room. And as Harry's eyes traveled up and down the familiar corridors, he noticed something else. This map showed a set of passages he had never entered, and many of them seemed to lead
"right into Hogsmeade," said Fred, tracing one of them with his finger. "There are 7 in all. Now, Filch knows about these 4, but we're sure we're the only ones who know about these. Don't bother with the one behind the mirror on the 4th floor. We used it until last winter, but it's caved in, completely blocked. And we don't reckon anyone's ever used this one because the Whomping Willow's planted right over the entrance. But this one here, this one leads right into the cellar of Honeydukes. We've used it loads of times. And as you might have noticed, the entrance is right outside this room, through that one-eyed old crone's hump." "Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs," sighed George, patting the heading of the map. "We owe them so much. Noblemen, working tirelessly to help a new generation of lawbreakers," said Fred solemnly. "Right," said George briskly. "Don't forget to wipe it after you've used it. Or anyone can read it," Fred said warningly. "Just tap it again and say, 'Mischief managed,' and it'll go blank."
"So, young Harry,"
said Fred in an uncanny impersonation of Percy,
"mind you, behave yourself."
"See you in Honeydukes," said George, winking.
They left the room, both smirking in a satisfied sort of way. Harry stood there, gazing at the miraculous map, He watched the tiny ink Mrs. Norris turn left and pause to sniff at something on the floor. If Filch really didn't know, he wouldn't have to pass the Dementors at all. But even as he stood there, flooded with excitement, something Harry had once heard Mr. Weasley say came floating out of his memory. "Never trust anything that can think for itself if you can't see where it keeps its brain." This map was one of those dangerous magical objects Mr. Weasley had warned against. Aids for magical mischief makers. But then, Harry reasoned, he only wanted to use it to get into Hogsmeade. It wasn't as though he wanted to steal anything or attack anyone. And Fred and George had been using it for years without anything horrible happening. Harry traced the secret passage to Honeydukes with his finger. Then, quite suddenly, as though following orders, he rolled up the map, stuffed it inside his robes, and hurried to the door of the classroom. He opened it a couple of inches. There was no one outside. Very carefully, he edged out of the room and behind the statue of the one-eyed witch. What did he have to do? He pulled out the map again and saw to his astonishment that a new ink figure had appeared on it, labeled Harry Potter. This figure was standing exactly where the real Harry was standing, about halfway down the third-floor corridor. Harry watched carefully. His little ink self appeared to be tapping the witch with his minute wand. Harry quickly took out his real wand and tapped the statue. Nothing happened. He looked at the map. The tiniest speech bubble had appeared next to his figure. The word inside said, "Descendium." "Descendium," Harry whispered, tapping the stone witch again. At once, the statue's hump opened wide enough to admit a fairly thin person. Harry glanced quickly up and down the corridor, then tucked the map away again, hoisted himself into the hole head first, and pushed himself forward. He slid a considerable way down what felt like a stone slide, then landed on cold, damp earth. He stood up, looking around. It was pitch dark. He held up his wand, muttered "Lumos," and saw that he was in a very narrow, low, earthy passageway. He raised the map, tapped it with the tip of his wand, and muttered, "Mischief managed." The map went blank at once. He folded it carefully, tucked it inside his robes, then, heart beating fast, both excited and apprehensive, he set off. The passage twisted and turned, more like the burrow of a giant rabbit than anything else. Harry hurried along it, stumbling now and then on the uneven floor, holding his wand out in front of him. It took ages, but Harry had the thought of Honeydukes to sustain him. After what felt like an hour, the passage began to rise. Panting, Harry sped up, his face hot, but his feet very cold. 10 minutes later, he came to the foot of some worn stone steps which rose out of sight above him. Careful not to make any noise, Harry began to climb. 100 steps, 200 steps. He lost count as he climbed, watching his feet. Then, without warning, his head hit something hard. It seemed to be a trapdoor. Harry stood there, massaging the top of his head and listening. He couldn't hear any sounds above him. Very slowly, he pushed the trapdoor open and peered over the edge. He was in a cellar, which was full of wooden crates and boxes. Harry climbed out of the trapdoor and replaced it. It blended so perfectly with the dusty floor that it was impossible to tell it was there. Harry crept slowly toward the wooden staircases that led upstairs. Now he could definitely hear voices, not to mention the tinkle of a bell and the opening and shutting of a door. Wondering what he ought to do, he suddenly heard a door open much closer at hand. Somebody was about to come downstairs. "And get another box of jelly slugs, dear. We're nearly cleaned out," said a woman's voice. A pair of feet was coming down the staircase. Harry leapt behind an enormous crate and waited for the footsteps to pass. He heard the man shifting boxes against the opposite wall. He might not get another chance. Quickly and silently, Harry dodged out from his hiding place and climbed the stairs. Looking back, he saw an enormous backside and shiny bald head buried in a box. Harry reached the door at the top of the stairs, slipped through it, and found himself behind the counter of honeydukes. He ducked, crept sideways, and then straightened up.